Okay, so we pick up with Second Corinthians 9 this time, and just to kind of bring everything up to speed in chapter 8, as I have there on the screen, the theme of that chapter was the collection for the saints, what the congregations in Macedonia and Acadia were putting together for the churches in Jerusalem primarily, but Judea as a whole. Paul was very impressed with their generosity. And then also at the end of the chapter, he praises Titus and others, and essentially sends them to make sure this offering is collected and taken to Jerusalem in a proper way, to follow up on it. So it does end up making a difference. So then we come to chapter 9. Sorry about the scrolling there. Come to chapter 9, and Paul starts initially again in this chapter. Of course, our chapter divisions don't necessarily follow the flow of thought. So it's finishing up Paul's comments about the collection. So 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 1, he says, "It is indeed unnecessary for me to write to you concerning the service of the saints," because he'd already done this in the previous letter, in the last chapter of First Corinthians, as we call it, because he says in verse 2, "For I know your willingness, of which I boast in your behalf to them of Macedonia and Achaia, has been prepared for a year past." So this was not just something they threw together. They had given it much thought and diligence and time to be able to collect whatever material, whatever resources, whatever money that they were going to forward onto them to help their brothers in Jerusalem. So he says, "Your zeal has stirred most of them up," meaning their example, that within this region, Achaia is a region as well. It's basically the peninsula part of what we call Greece today. Macedonia was further up on the northwest coast of the Aegean Sea, still what we might call North Greece and some of those other areas now, in terms of modern nations. And so the example of the Corinthians had inspired others within the region, motivated others to contribute as well. So verse 3, but he says, "I've sent the brothers," and this goes back to chapter 8. We don't know who the brothers were except for Titus. There were others that Paul talked about. So he says, "I've sent them that our boasting on your behalf may not be in vain in this respect, that just as I have said, you may be prepared." Um, Sort of qualifier statement here, I've sent them in part so that you don't make me look bad, because I've already bragged about you in this matter. And so encouraging them further, if you will, to continue in what they're doing. Verse 4, "Lest by any means, if anyone from Macedonia comes there with me and finds you unprepared, we, to say nothing of you, would be disappointed in this confident boasting," disappointed or embarrassed. Because again, he's been very happy with their generosity, their example, their desire to serve, and he's been bragging on them. And so he's just again kind of reminding them, "Look, I've done this, so don't make me look bad here, and go ahead and
Testing,
follow
testing.
through on what you have desired to do for your brethren." So verse 5, excuse me, says, "I thought it necessary, therefore, to entreat the brothers that they would go before you and arrange ahead of time the generous gift that you promised before, the same might be ready as a matter of generosity and not as greediness." So here he's sort of transitioning his thought a bit to talk more about their generosity in terms of spiritual matters. So it's not just the physical things that they would be giving, the money, the resources, whatever it happens to be, but that their generosity would be evident, and that it has the right attitude, if you will, behind it. So verse 6, he says, "Remember this, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. He who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully." So this is a spiritual principle. Now, he's not sort of obligating or demanding that they give more than they can, but he's also reminding them not to be cheap, if you will, not to hold back, to give what they can truly give, because this is a spiritual principle of God. If we hold back blessings to others, whether it's money or other things, then there is, I'm trying to think how to say this properly. God can hold back from us, not that it's tit for tat, but that he sees our heart. God is very much desirous to bless the attitudes that reflect him. So he could withhold blessings, if you will, or he could just not bless as much. But the principle here is that if you're going to give the best you can give. Because he says, he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. You're rarely going to get more than you sow unless God blesses it. What you put in is at least what you're going to get out. And usually what we sow, we don't even get all of that back, do we? If we think in terms of crops that are planted or so forth, there's always a loss. Not every seed germinates, not every plant produces the maximum amount of whatever the plant is. So he's talking about blessings here, and the Greek does indicate a blessing. This word bountiful is talking about blessings. So if we just say it that way, he who sows blessings will also reap blessings, because it's, again, a principle of God. It's a matter of his character. This is what he desires to do for us and what he desires for us to do for each other. So I have a couple of verses there. Proverbs 11, verse 24, I'll read to you, and it simply says, there is one who scatters, yet increases more. There is one who withholds more than is right, but it leads to poverty. Now, this doesn't always play out in the world around us, because some of the cheapest people I've known have been wealthy people. Not always, but to a large degree. They're worried about losing what they've accumulated. Conversely, some of the most generous people are the people that have sparse resources. They're giving of their time, they're giving of themselves, they're giving what they do have. And this is the blessing that we're talking about here. In Proverbs 22 and verse 9, we read that he who has a generous eye will be blessed, for he gives of his bread to the poor. Again, this matter that God blesses what we do. He will bring back more than we give, not always monetarily or in the same resources, but even in other ways. And so in Galatians 6 and in verse 7, Paul himself says this as well. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. Now, that can get into other things to make sure we're sowing what we want to reap. But nonetheless, there is a return because of God's involvement, if you will, the blessing of those characteristics or those attitudes. So back to 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 7, he says, let each man give according as he's determined in his heart. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. He's not telling them they have to give to their own hurt. Unfortunately, we did that as part of our church history in the past. I never liked that because it embarrassed those that didn't have the resources, which is why I don't announce dollar amounts when we give offerings. That's not the point. God can magnify whatever we're giving. He can make a dollar stretch out and cover so much more. That's not the point. It's what we have looked inwardly to our own selves, our own heart, and acknowledged the blessings that God has, and we say to ourselves, what can I contribute? And we determine in our heart. So he says, not grudgingly, that we feel an obligation. I have to. When I worked in the public world, sometimes depending on the company I worked for, they'd have these drives through United Way or other things, and they would really make you feel guilty if you didn't contribute in some way, which was usually a dollar amount out of your paycheck every week. And they make it so that you have to. And I don't know of anybody that did it very willingly. So this grudging nature that you feel like you have to, or under compulsion. And this is back to the spiritual principle. For God loves a cheerful giver. The attitude of what we do is in many ways just as important, if not more so, than what we do, what we give. So this matter of again, blessing, sowing blessing, and reaping blessing. I've got some verses there again. So if we go back to Romans chapter 12, and in verse 8, Paul here says, he who exhorts in exhortation, he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, he shows mercy with cheerfulness. The reference there is he who gives, do it with liberality. So again, this is not always money. A lot of times it's our time, ourselves, but it can also be giving in what we say. It can be giving in how we treat people, even if there's no exchange of anything. So this matter of a cheerful giver and the attitude that we have in these things, even going back to the tabernacle, when God asked through Moses for the people to contribute the material for the creation of the tabernacle, they just gave and gave and gave. They were so happy and excited, if you will, to be a nation, to be out from underneath the boot of Egypt, to know that God was their God and it was taking care of them. God finally had to say through Moses, okay, it's good enough. This is all we need. You can tell them to stop. And when you consider, the wealth that they had coming out of Egypt, the movies always get it wrong. They make them look like this ragtag band of people that were homeless and they didn't have anything decent to wear. It's all, rags and draping off their bodies, ready to fall off. And they had a lot of money. They had a lot of material in terms of like fabric or hides or even animals. I mean, they went out, when it says with a high hand, that doesn't just mean that they were happy. They went out with resources. And so God blessed them in these things. God loves a cheerful giver. So verse 9 here, verse 8 of 2 Corinthians 9. For God is able to make all grace abound to you, that you, always having all sufficiency in everything, may abound to good work. Now, the word grace here in this context refers to giving. God is able to make all giving abound. So the principle that I've talked about at times is, the matter of being unable, if you will, to outgive God. That as we give, God blesses us to give more, whether it's money, whether it's time, whether it's resources, whatever way, in other ways to continue. And abound means to go above and beyond, to have more in abundance. So in terms of blessings, to have more than we thought we would have or that we gave away. And again, it's not that God is tit for tat, but this is just God's nature, that he blesses us when we do things that reflect him, because he is love. So that you will always have these things. You will have what you need. Verse 9, as it is written, he has scattered abroad, he has given to the poor, his righteousness remains forever. But if you do a search in most concordances or Bible helps for this reference, it usually doesn't show up, because what Paul is actually doing here is quoting from the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. So the wording ends up being different, obviously, because you're translating it into a different language. But he's quoting here from Psalm 112, verse 9. God's righteousness remains forever. Verse 10 then, now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply your seed for sowing and increase the fruit of your righteousness. God gives us everything to begin with. And as we give back a portion in whatever form and whatever way to others or to God himself, then he multiplies. This is what he's talking about. He supplies and multiplies what we have. And again, we can't outgive God. Not that we should try to in the wrong way, but as we invest in the right things, if you will, as we spend our money on the right things, as we use it in times to help others, to be a part of what God is doing through his church and so forth, then he blesses that. Hosea 10 and verse 12 says, sow for yourself righteousness, reap in mercy, Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the eternal till he comes and rains righteousness on you. That what we're talking about here primarily, of course, is our spiritual approach and attitudes and what we sow and what we reap. It applies physically as well, as Israel kept the Jubilee, which they didn't very often actually, but as they gave the land rest, God would bless them. As they went into the land, he told them, leave the land as a rest. Don't harvest anything this year, the next year, and the third year. I will bless more than you can imagine. And he would do those things. Because again, we're taking care of what he has created. We're using it for the purposes that he's designed them to be used. So this multiplying of our seed for sowing, verse 11, he says, you being enriched in everything to all generosity, which produces through us thanksgiving. That is, God blesses us, multiplies our seed, if you will, increases the fruit of righteousness so that we're enriched to give more. We're better able to serve. We're better able to give of our time. We have more money resources to use in those ways and so forth. Verse 12 then, for this service of giving that you perform not only makes up for lack among the saints, but abounds also through much giving of thanks, seeing that through the proof given by this service, they glorify God, that is those who receive the blessing from them, they glorify God for the obedience of your confession to the gospel of Christ and for the generosity of your contribution to them all and to all, while they themselves also, with supplication on your behalf, yearn for you by reason of exceeding grace in God in you. Now, I read through 12 and 14 because, as you can see on the screen there, I've got numbers. This is part of the reciprocity of what I'm talking about and what God does. So let's unpack this a little bit. Paul says the service of giving that you perform makes up for lack. That's obvious, right? One group helping to provide for the needs of another group. This is the family aspect of one part of the family taking care of the other part. In this case, those in Jerusalem didn't even have access. Even if they could have, in some way, whatever form or fashion, they would not have been able to purchase or obtain. It just wasn't there. And so it makes up for that. What the members here in Achaia, in Greece, are doing. So then two, but it abounds through much giving of thanks because of the blessing provided from one to the other. Then God gets the glory because it all comes from him, going back up to what we read earlier. Let me read to you Matthew 5 there. Matthew 5 and verse 16. This is Christ's Sermon on the Mount, and he says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works, excuse me, and glorify your Father in heaven. The reason we are to do good works is not only to serve our fellow man, ideally, especially our brethren, but also so that God receives glory because of the generosity, because of the desire to serve and help and so forth. So it helps those that have need, gives thanks or glorifies God. Number three, then, they glorify God for the obedience of your confession, meaning it shows, because they're glorifying God, they're acknowledging the obedience of the members to serve and reflect God. And that sermon is preached better in service than it is in words. Because, people watch how people do things. And you can give, as he says up above, you can give of a grudging heart, you can give out of hypocrisy, you can give for all kinds of reasons that are not good or the best. But here, those things then also reflect our calling because they see what we do. Doing speaks volumes above what we say. They have to back each other up, but without the doing, the words are very empty for most people. So it shows our calling and our response to the calling. And so then number four, then also it, I don't want to say obligates, but it provides the reminder for those who receive to pray for those that give. And it reminds those that give to pray for those that are receiving. So then you add to all of this bonding of continuing to beseech God to take care of the needs of all his people. So then the last verse here of this chapter, he says, now thanks be to God for his unspeakable gift, all that he gives us, the breath of life, the air we breathe, of course, the food that we have, the rain comes on the just and the unjust, all of these things, because he is trying to show mankind what he is doing and desires for them. So then moving into chapter 10, since we have time in this time, chapter 9 was a little shorter. Moving to chapter 10, Paul transitions again to another topic. He spent about a chapter and a half, if you will, praising them for their generosity, reminding them to follow through, and then also showing them what their cheerful heart, if you will, what their desire to give produces. So then now he has to move to defending his ministry. So even though he wrote what we call the first book of Corinthians to correct a number of things, as the apostle, as the pastor, if you will, of those congregations being established, he needed to remind them of what was in God's word and the expectation of condemning sin and yet restoring the sinner and all of these things. There were those still in Corinth that for their own desires, their own promotion, their own power, or whatever it happened to be, they rejected Paul's authority. And so this kind of bubbled under the surface. It was there. I don't know that I would say that it was front and center, but it was there. And so 2 Corinthians 10 and verse 1, he begins this defense, if you will. So he says, now I, Paul, myself, entreat you by the humility and gentleness of Christ, I who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent and bold to you. Now, this humility and gentleness of Christ is a good reminder of how we should approach things, because Christ never demanded anything. When he went out to teach, he didn't demand people come listen to him. He didn't rebuke the Sadducees and Pharisees in order to gain an audience. Usually they were there and they were provoking him when he would rebuke them. In other words, he was very humble in his approach and gentle as well, but by way of contrast, way more gentle than the Pharisees and Sadducees were in how they treated people, the compassion, the mercy that Christ had regularly. So Paul's saying, look, this is the attitude in which I'm coming to you. And Paul's saying here, I am lowly among you. That can be taken a number of different ways. He always considered him the apostle outside the apostles. He was not part of the 12. He didn't spend his the 3.5 years of Christ's ministry with him directly. He had his own separate training, if you will. He had a different calling in terms of the audience that he was to go to. But many will also say that he wasn't very good looking. We'll come to that towards the end of the chapter. But he says, in spite of that, I'm bold towards you. He's not apologizing, if you will. He's not this meek pushover. So verse 3, yes, I beg you that I may not, when present, show courage with confidence, which I intend to be bold against some who consider us to be walking according to the flesh. In other words, Paul's saying, I don't want to have to come and be hard about this, because some are saying that we are walking according to the flesh. This is usually, it's one of those sort of straw man arguments. Oftentimes people will criticize others in the very things that they're weak in or that they are doing wrong. And so in this case, the critics of Paul are saying He's doing this simply for, and then fill in the blank. He's doing this for the money. He's doing this because he has to. He's doing this because he wants the power and recognition. He's doing this because he can control people, whatever it happens to be in terms of the accusation. So verse 3 says, although we walk in the flesh, we don't wage war according to the flesh. This is not about this lifetime, he's saying. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but powerful before God to the throwing down of strongholds. Paul says, look, I'm not in this for the physical things. If he was, he had a very hard go of it. The number of times he was beaten or stoned or shipwrecked or in prison or all the things that he dealt with. But he recognizes, and he wants them to understand this as well. Look, what we're really fighting against, they're not other people, even though they might be the ones that are the source physically. We're really fighting against wrong spiritual attitudes. The word flesh there in verse 4 literally means temporal, temporary, or physical. So it's not about fighting against those physical things of this life, rather throwing down these attitudes. So verse 5, continuing the thought, he says, throwing down reasonings and every high thing that is exalted against the knowledge of God, and bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. So in an indirect way, he's showing how these critics are wrong here to start out with, because he's saying, look, they're missing the point. They may be only seeing the physical things, but that's not really what we're fighting against. And in fact, their reasonings are wrong. And those are the things that we need to make sure we have captive, that we control our mind, we control our emotions, we control our attitudes, if you will, our emotions. So then continue in verse 6, he says, and being in readiness to avenge all disobedience, when your obedience will be made full. The word avenge there is not a very good translation. The Greek literally means to vindicate, as in a legal proceeding that you have dealt with and shown an accusation to be ineffective or not valid. You're vindicated. And in that case, you are avenged. But our English language has a different immediate context. So this matter of avenging, think of it as clearing away an accusation into disobedience. So he's getting a little more direct here, but reminding others that are not part of this issue that their obedience will be made full as they do these things as well. Their spiritual maturity, if you will be shown. So verse 7, do you look at things only as they appear in front of your face? That's always a dangerous thing to do, isn't it? But it's a logical thing from a human perspective, because that's all we have. Now, psychology and such has developed enough in the last 3, 4 or so decades that there's more of a science, if you will, to understanding some of these things, that we can discern whether it's these facial micro expressions. That's a whole study right there. Understanding tone, if you will, when people are responding, when they're being sarcastic, that it may not sound like it up front, or they're being passive aggressive, or these sort of things. So he's saying, look, is this the way you're viewing these things? Only as they look? If anyone trusts in himself that he is Christ, if there is any church member that acknowledges, yes, I am of Christ, Paul says, let him consider this again with himself, that even as he is at Christ, so are we. So basically he's saying, look, if you understand where you are with Christ, and you're dealing with bringing in these thoughts of captivity, and you're not judging according to the flesh or even warring against the flesh in that way, and you can acknowledge that, can you see that in us? And what he's saying is, by way of allusion, if you will, these critics are not even giving us that consideration. He'll repeat this thought a couple of times. So verse 8, for though I should boast somewhat abundantly concerning our authority. I mean, you look at how Paul was called. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. He was their hammer before God converted him. He was putting people in prison. He was having people like Stephen put to death. I mean, he was going out and he was trying to crush this heresy as he saw it. And then God struck him down in a miraculous way and began to use him to go to the Gentile world. And you look at the miracles that he did, you look at the amazing things that he went through in service to God, how God opened doors and where he went. He said, I could boast about all of that. And usually, well, I shouldn't say usually, when he did boast of his authority, it was usually to contrast or to correct those that were condemning him. He was simply stating fact. Here's what I've gone through. I do have some authority here. But he says, which the Lord, this authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not casting you down. That as ministers, their job is to build people up, not to break or control them. That's not always seen. It can be heady stuff to be sort of viewed as the expert or the go-to person or the last word. But he says, to the extent that I will boast in my authority, I do it so that you are built up. And see, he says essentially, for that, I will not be ashamed. So he's not apologizing for his authority given to him by Christ to go out and preach and to teach and to correct as necessary. He's not going to apologize for being strong in these things because we were talking about eternal life. Usually when we are reticent to correct things, it doesn't make it better. Almost never makes it better. We need to address issues as brothers. We need to be able to see God's word. We need to come to an understanding together so that we can move forward. Blessings come from that. Criticizing rarely, if ever, brings any of that. I'm not talking about correction. I'm talking about criticism. So then to continue in verse 9, he says, that I may not seem as if I desire to terrify you by my letters, meaning he's also reminding them that while the critics can say, well, look, Paul is just condemning us. Look how harsh he's being. He doesn't even really understand the situation and he's just piling on or, whatever it was they were saying. He says, look, I to the extent that I use my authority, I'm trying to help you. I want to build you up, verse 8. For that, I'm not going to apologize. He says, but I say that so that you're not terrified, because that's what some were trying to do. They were trying to paint Paul as this person they needed to be fearful of because you don't know what he's going to do next. We're here to take care of you. We're the kind ones. This is the false premise that they were generating. So, because he says in verse 10, he's quoting some of their argument. For his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is despised. He says, well, part of Paul is that he does this through these letters because in person, he's nothing like this. He has no confidence. He has no authority. After all, we're the ones with authority. He can't even communicate in a way that resonates with people. So the matter of bodily presence is weak. I have to wonder if that wasn't a jab at whatever the thorn in the flesh that Paul had was. Some people will marginalize if somebody is not physically healthy or complete as a reflection of their spiritual presence, if you will, state, and say, well, and I've heard people say this, well, they're sick because they haven't repented of something. They're dealing with this chronic health trial because they have refused to change. God is not pleased with them. And I suspect that's part of what was being done there as well. So verse 11, let such a person consider this. He's speaking to the members regarding the critics. So he said, so let a critic consider this, that we who are in word by letters, when we are absent, okay, let him think about this. If this is the way I write, then such are we also indeed when we are present. He's saying, look, don't let them fool you. I'm not a pushover when it comes to God's truth. And I think as a church, we do a better job of separating these two things. There are personal preferences, there are personal opinions and such, but we can never make those equal with God's truth. And so what he's saying is, when it comes to me being your pastor, being the evangelist, being the apostle God's called me to be, do not be deceived. If I'm strong in my letters, I'm going to be strong when I'm in presence. But keep in mind, going back up, that he says, I do this, verse 8, for building you up. So Paul can have this reputation of just this really hard driven, no compromise, misogynistic man. And that was not him at all. He was very direct when it came to God's truth. He was uncompromising when it came to God's truth. But this was a man that cared deeply for God's people. You go back to the account in Acts when he was in Ephesus for 3 years and he finally had to leave, and the members were crying. They were so sad to see him go. That's not somebody that rules through fear and power and intimidation. And he even said to them, "You're breaking my heart. I've got to go." So anyway, Paul gets painted in this bad light, even beyond what these critics are saying. So verse 12, for we do not count ourselves or compare ourselves with some of those who commend themselves. Paul says, I'm not going to get into this. I'm not going to get into the tit for tat and, well, they've got that experience, I've got this experience, they've got that training, I've got this training, or whatever it happens to be. He says, I'm not going to get into this. He says, but they themselves, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves with themselves, are without understanding, because they're measuring against the wrong thing. They were judging themselves against their own standards, which is no different than what the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the scribes did, right? They created their own standard and they gave themselves their own excuses, and they judged others against their standard and behavior. And Paul says, I'm not going to get into that because they're not even in the right spot, you know. It's not even the right question. Sometimes people will do that. What do you think of this? And oftentimes we want to just answer the question. And how many times did Christ essentially say, you're not even asking the right question. I'm not even going to answer that. Here's the right question. Why are you not doing this? So verse 13, Paul says, but we will not boast beyond our proper limits, which means that he will boast, if you will, within the proper limits. What is the proper limits? The boundaries with which God has appointed to us. He never apologized for being an apostle. He never apologized for teaching God's truth. He never apologized for correcting them. He always desired for them to come to a deeper understanding and a relationship with God. So we can boast, any of us can boast in what God has given to us in terms of the service in the right way when it comes up, if we have to defend what we're doing. Not that we go out and just tell everybody, okay, you need to know, here's what I've done. That's not what he's talking about here. In the course of serving and leading and teaching, Paul says, I can boast in that because it's what God has asked me to do. Verse 14, for we don't stretch ourselves too much as though we didn't reach to you. So there were probably some that were saying, well, Paul's only giving you the scraps. You know, he's so busy with so many other things. You know, he got wind of this one thing over here and he's beating you up over that. And he doesn't even really know what's going on here. And Paul's saying, no, 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 no. It's not that I don't have enough time here. I haven't stretched myself and I don't have enough whatever resources or money or time or access or whatever. He says, as though we didn't reach you. I did spend time with you, he said, for we came even as far as to you with the gospel of Christ. You know, it wasn't a wink and a nod in our vernacular, you know, our vocabulary rather. Here's a booklet, and he races off to the next thing. He says, and not boasting beyond proper limits in other men's labors. You know, that we didn't take credit for what others have done. He even talked about what Peter had done and what Apollos had done. And he always gave acknowledgement, if you will, to even Timothy and Titus and their service and others. So he's essentially saying, when I do boast, I'm only going to boast on the things of me, what I've done through Christ. He says, but having hope that as your faith grows, we will be abundantly enlarged by you in our sphere of influence. So he says, as I do those things that God has asked me to do, given me the responsibility to do, I do it in the hope that your faith grows, your spiritual development increases. And consequently, what I'm doing, and those with me, what we're doing is further increased as others see that, right? Then Paul has credibility with other congregations and other audiences and other places he will go. So he says, so as to preach the gospel even to parts beyond you. Because he had addressed Corinth. I mean, he helped establish the congregation there, obviously through God's blessing. He spent time with them. He moved on to other areas, but then he's coming back, if you will, in letter and sending others there to help him in presence to continue to work with them. But he says, I came and I didn't build on something someone else did, not to boast in what someone else has already done. But verse 17, this is a paraphrase of Jeremiah 9:24 and what he said earlier in the first letter. He who boasts, let him boast in the Lord. This goes back up to, we can boast in what God has us do. Verse 13, within the boundaries that God has appointed to us. Verse 18, then, to finish out the chapter, he says, for it isn't he who commends himself who is approved, but whom the Lord commends. So these guys can claim to be the authorities. They can be the legitimate heir to the throne, if you will. They can say that they're the ones that really should be listened to. That doesn't approve them, because it's God who does the final approving. So, kind of summarizing all this, Paul is essentially saying, don't just listen to what they're saying, but when you do listen to it, compare it to what I'm teaching you and what Christ is speaking through me. And then look also at the reasons they're doing these things, where they're boasting, what they want out of it. And to be reminded, God is the ultimate one who has the final say here. So before I close this out today, then I want to kind of talk about Paul's appearance. So on the screen there, you see a composite image that was created based on a lot of historical sources after the life of Paul, taken with a grain of salt, because in many cases, these sources were speaking of Paul 100 years or so later after his death. But nonetheless, there's some consistency in what these accounts record, because the scriptures itself don't really describe Paul in physical appearance. But what's generally agreed upon, that he was a small man. Now, what do you mean by small? Well, I think the average height of a man in the US is around 5'10". Okay, so that would be average. We're used to seeing people that are much taller because that's attractive for some reason with human nature. We especially see it in sports and business. People that are taller, more handsome in appearance, generally get better opportunities. But Paul was probably about 4.5 feet tall. We would consider that extremely short. But even Napoleon for his day was known to be short. He was actually average of his time, around 5'6". That would be short again from our modern US standard. But it also is generally accepted that Paul was bald or balding. And that in general, he just didn't have a very appealing, if you will, look. He was not somebody that had this natural physical attraction that you would look at him and say, wow, that's a good looking man. He could do some modeling. That was not Paul. He was very plain and average looking, essentially an average looking Jew of the day, much like Christ was. Um, so anyway, I just kind of wanted to highlight that because going back up to the beginning of it, he says, that I am lowly in presence among you. The Greek world valued beauty as well. When you look at their statues, the proportions and the symmetry of faces and all these hallmarks of beauty that are accepted in the Western world, even in the Greek world, Paul didn't have any of that. Okay, so we'll pick up obviously chapter 11 next time.